So, hello, my name is Trianna Oglivie, and I am a PhD student in speech, language, and hearing sciences, and my minor is in cognitive science, which is a part of the GIDP. Today I will be presenting a poster on receptive language skills in specific language impairment. So to give you a bit of a background, specific language impairment is characterized by poor language ability in the absence of hearing impairment, cognitive impairment, and frank neurological damage. It is actually one of the most common childhood disabilities, one of the most common reasons that children in our school systems receive special education services. So it is in our interest to understand more about specific language impairment and how to treat it. One of the things is that specific language impairment is characterized by deficits in expressive language, which is production of language, and then also receptive language, which is comprehension of language. Historically, there's been much more of an emphasis on expressive language deficits, on the production. And really that's because it's much easier, if you think about it, to identify a child that has production deficits. They're not forming their sentences correctly, they're not learning words quickly, and so those are one of the things that have caused this focus on expressive language deficits. Additionally, the lack of receptive measures. So when we're testing and identifying these deficits, expressive language deficits are often easier to identify in assessments versus receptive comprehension deficits. And lastly, we make this, or it has been made, this distinction between receptive and expressive deficits as if they are two distinct categories in the disorder, when in fact, if you have an expressive deficit, it's likely that you have a comprehension or receptive deficit because you don't understand the reasons for certain grammatical structures or the need to use those grammatical structures. So the purpose of this study was to examine the receptive language skills in children with specific language impairment, specifically preschool age children. What we did was we looked at children with and without specific language impairment across 3 different receptive language measures. And we did this in order to identify each measure's ability to discriminate between children with and without the disorder, as well as examine how frequently receptive deficits are documented on the different measures. And lastly, to determine whether receptive deficits tend to be test-specific or are detected with multiple receptive language measures. What we hope to do is by comparing performance on different types of receptive language tests, we hope to show the different effects of these tests. So if you use one test versus using another, what type of or what difference in receptive language areas these children may have, and also what local and global deficits they may have. We hypothesize that the measures will differ in their ability to discriminate between children with and without the disorder, and that receptive language deficits are not just characteristic of children with very severe specific language impairment, because that is also something that we see, that there will be a diagnosis for a child with expressive language impairment because they're not as severe. But in fact, like I said before, there likely is a comprehension portion connected to that expressive language deficit. So in our study, I'll go over the methods now. In our study, we had 39 children with and without the diagnosis of specific language impairment. The typically developing children were age-matched and sex-matched peers with typical language development. They were native English speakers. They passed their hearing screening, and they also demonstrated normal cognitive functioning as evidenced on their performance of the Kaufman Assessment Battery of Children, a typical cognitive assessment. Children were classified as having the disorder using the Structured Photographic Expressive Language Test, Preschool 2nd edition, and that's a test that has been found to be very sensitive and specific in identifying and correctly identifying children with and without the disorder. The 3 tests that we gave to these children as a part of the experiment were the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, the Grammatical Understanding Subtests of the Test of Language Development, primary, and lastly, Shirts and Shoes, which is a test that's currently in development. Now, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is a pointing test, and it looks at single word lexical knowledge. So children are asked to point to a specific item in a set of 4 pictures. So if they're told, show me the swimming pool, they have a set of 4 pictures and they must identify the object. For the TOLD, the grammatical understanding test of language development, it's very similar. It's also a picture pointing format. And so children are given a sentence. It looks at morphosyntactic comprehension. Children are given a sentence such as, the dog was walked by the boy. And again, there's 4 different pictures and the child is told to correctly identify the picture. And lastly, shirts and shoes. That's also looking at morphosyntax comprehension, but it's looking at also clause types, spatial and temporal terms, and subordinating and coordinating conjunctions. And the response format is different. It's movement of tokens. So there's a set of tokens that the children are asked to move. An example item would be move the big shoes under the small shirt. So let me go over the results. All the children were given these tests, and then we used separate linear discriminant functioning analysis for each language test. And what we found that across the 3 tests, there was a significant group difference between children with specific language impairment and children with typical language skills. So the children with typical language skills did outperform the children with specific language impairment. So we do see that difference across the 3 tests, but the differences were on the test, although they were statistically different. The differences were much more clinically relevant on the shirts and shoes test, whereas on the Peabody and the TOLD, the children scored within the norm mean. On the shirts and shoes test, they did not, and so it was much more clinically relevant. And you can reference the poster for the exact numbers on that on their performance. Another area that we looked at, again, was the diagnostic accuracy compared to our original SPELT 2 classification of specific language impairment. And unfortunately, none of the tests met the 80% criteria for the sensitivity and specificity of identifying language impairment. So sensitivity is the ability of the test to actually identify those with the disorder as having this disorder, and specificity is the ability of the test to identify those without the disorder as not having the disorder. And in all 3 of those tests, they were below the 80% mark that is usually called upon for clinical usefulness. And lastly, we looked at the SLI, the classification overlap between measures. And what we found was that 61 children, so 78% of all participants, actually scored as language impaired on at least one of the receptive tests. But when we look specifically at the children with specific language impairment, 37 of those children, so 95% of the group with language impairment, actually received the classification of language impairment on one of those 3 tests. So overall, just to go over the findings of our results, overall, the children with specific language impairment had weaker receptive language skills. So this is telling us that yes, there is not necessarily this separate, distinct category of expressive language impairment, but there actually is a receptive component to their disability. And then what else we found was that no measure actually achieved that sensitivity and specificity that we need for clinical usefulness, so that in our field we currently really do need more sensitive receptive language measures to identify this in the population. And then lastly, the measures didn't always identify the same set of children when they're looking at receptive language skills. So as I mentioned, not all of the children were identified on each of the tests. So it may be that some children have problems with morphosyntax and other children have problems with lexical knowledge, but it's important as clinicians in our field and when we're diagnosing these impairments that we're looking across the different areas of grammatical knowledge for children with this impairment. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to look at the poster. Thank you.